This means that the US empire, which is built on using the US dollar around the world, is falling apart. Without the money that comes in from being the global bank, Washington would lose a lot of money. When there are people who constantly believe in and support a Ponzi scheme, it works. But when people realize this is a Ponzi scheme, they believe the whole thing falls apart. This is why the BRICS countries are aggressively moving away from the dollar, and the dollar's use around the world is falling quickly, like when a kingdom ends. Max Keiser talks about how the coming economic problem has been building for years. Thinking that a terrible event is only a few months away, he talks about how bad it is for many countries' paper money systems and uses recent inflation numbers to show how unstable these systems are and how they are still going up. Keiser talks about the real effects, like how people are having a harder time paying for things like rent, food, and energy. He says that the economy is getting out of hand and that the interest on US debt is now higher than the budget for the defense. Keiser says that the economic growth claims made by trickle-down economics have not come true. This pattern, which involves trillions of dollars, shows how making money and misallocating investments have caused capital to disappear, has filled in a vague financial hole that is controlled by big accounting firms. He thinks that Bitcoin will become the standard. Keiser says that waves of bank failures have sped things up. Hundreds of banks are bankrupt and only stay open with questionable accounts, which will become clear as more banks fail in the coming months. We can see that all that money causes inflation, which then wipes them out. People are angry and say they won't send money to Ukraine, but to get to the point, they should be fighting against getting rid of fiat money and switching to Bitcoin like we do in El Salvador. Then you can enjoy the Salvadoran miracle too. The Bitcoin system works in a circle. People in the US are upset about things like money going to Ukraine, but it's all done in Bitcoin. There you go, the government makes the money. Then no one will be able to stop them. It can be printed and sent to Ukraine. You can use Bitcoin for the rest of your life in El Salvador if you want to. The rate of acceptance is going up every month and every year. But if you want to do it now, my friend Mike Peterson of Bitcoin Beach started the Bitcoin revolution in El Zante. The circle economy in El Zante and in El Salvador. To get cash, these guys had to walk 20 miles down the road to an ATM, which was a great pain. But on the Bitcoin standard, it doesn't matter where you're from or what currency you have. If you have a Bitcoin, you can buy things because local businesses accept Bitcoin. The exchange is instant and no one can stop them. Now that the center of freedom has moved from the US to El Salvador, you can't stop or limit it. This is what I tell people: leave the US. The US is now at the back of the line. They are no longer the bright city on the hill. That means the US is now the place to go. It's a hole, that's all. Let's go to the Banana Republic. It was not long ago that President McKinley spoke to CPAC. He talked about inflation in the US and how the country is now making its own debt pay off. No one else wants to buy American debt, so the US makes money to pay off its own debt. People in the US used to laugh at Central America and say, you have to buy your own debt. This is called debt monetization. You're a banana republic. And now the president of El Salvador is telling people at CPAC in Washington, D.C. that they are making money off of their own debt. So the US is the only country that can do this, and the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency since World War II. It's like they kicked Iran off a quick and sanctioned Russia and took their assets. So your point is that they've turned the dollar into a weapon, which is bad because it makes these countries want to find an alternative to the dollar, which is what they're doing. So the BRICS countries are aggressively moving away from the dollar, and the number of places that use the dollar is falling. This means that the US empire, which was built on people around the world using the dollar, is falling apart, and Washington will lose a lot of money that comes in from being the global bank. This is a Ponzi scheme, and a Ponzi scheme can only work if there are always people who believe in and support it. When people figure out it's a scam and leave, the whole thing falls apart. Suddenly, like that, the end of any empire, and that's where the US empire is now. For 50 to 60 years, the US dollar empire has been the last inning of a huge Ponzi scheme. When it falls, it will be like Building 7, it will just fall in its own place, and everyone will be confused about how it happened. There was no warning at all. They'll come up with a reason, but it was sudden and terrible. It's, the southern lines are out of control, and they can see that fewer and fewer Salvadorans are coming up from El Salvador. Because of this, they love President Bukele because he's helping them with a big problem that they have at their southern border, and they want other countries to do the same. Do what Bukele did, and the number of people crossing the southern line would go down, which brings us to your second point. It's hard to do. There's the IMF to think about. This means that the IMF, or International Monetary Fund, is in his book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins wrote about this. He worked for Wall Street bankers and the IMF. When a country in Southern or Central America did something that Wall Street bankers didn't like, they would send in the economic hitman and, throw the leader of that country out of an airplane, etc. And there are many cases of this in history. It's not a question. They do this all the time, and they did it today. That job is being done by the IMF. Its goal is for every country in the world to use the US dollar. People are very scared because Donald Trump said last week that he would go after countries that stopped using the dollar. A lot of people are scared that the dollar will lose its status as a world reserve currency. They can't do anything about it, but you know how the IMF works. A lot of what President Buchel has, let's say he went head-to-head with the IMF, he is now in the process of leaving the IMF, which means the economy is growing enough without their help. Thanks a lot, by the way. Here is El Salvador's balance sheet. A lot of money in the country is in Bitcoin, nearly $1 billion worth. In spite of all this money chaos, they're putting Bitcoin in their savings, which helps them grow. In other words, they not only use it as regular money, but the country has also added Bitcoin to their books. People are sending us $1 million as part of a program called Adopting El Salvador Passport. This will get us a pass to El Salvador and a passport within 2 weeks. After that, the money goes into Bitcoin. There's another type of financial architecture going on that supports Bitcoin. This means that the country will not only use Bitcoin as money, but it will also become a fully reserved Bitcoin country. This could make it the richest country in the world since everyone is throwing this at the fiat money mess. I can promise you that El Salvador will become the next Singapore. In the next 5 to 7 years, the GDP will triple here. Jim, this is the spot for you. The US is a terrible place to live. What do you mean by if you want? Enjoy your time in that vile hellhole. But if you want to be a part of the change where people are hopeful and building the future, and there is freedom of speech and the economy, read on. El Salvador is the only country in the world. El Salvador is the only country in the world that is just one country. El Salvador is the only country in the world that does that. El Salvador is the only country in the world that does that.